Welcome to Mr. Johnson. He's a distinguished TechCom guru, and he has a very popular website. I'd rather be writing, and I'm taking a tutorial on API documentation on his site. It's very popular. Oh, Lauren is here as well. Hi, Lauren. So you go ahead, Tom.
Okay. All right. Just to give a little background about myself, so you have an idea who's talking. I live in Silicon Valley, which is San Jose area of California. I work at Amazon Lab 126. This is the part of Amazon that does things like the Amazon Echo or Fire TV or Kindle, the devices side of things. My focus is on developer documentation. I love building sites with tools like Jekyll, static site generator, and playing around with different strategies for doc websites. I have a creative writing background. I have 4 daughters, and I am a basketball fan. All right. If you don't have the link to the slides, you can follow along at the URL listed here. I'm assuming everybody can see my screen. If not, just go ahead and let me know. I am recording this, so it'll be available if you miss it as well. All right. One thing to note about the slides, you'll notice that there are little arrows in the side, and here's how that works. Basically, you can go right or you can go down. Pretty much, I go down when I'm drilling into a principle, and I move right when I'm going on to the next slide. So that's one feature to keep in mind. All right, let me start out by talking a little bit about this topic and what we're going to talk about. The title is User-Centered Design Principles for Organizing Documentation. And here's how I started kind of getting into this topic. I was reading this book on user-centered design, and I've also done some previous stuff in usability labs. Let me come back to this slide here. In fact, this picture is from maybe this is just a sample generic usability lab, but I worked at a previous company that had a lab that looked very similar. And basically you have a two-way glass where you can observe users and see what they do. And we had a usability team that would kind of test out applications, and I said, hey, will you also test out the documentation? I'd love to see what the result is, right? Get to see a user actually use your documentation. Well, these usability sessions were amazingly exciting and frustrating at the same time. And we gathered some insights like, hey, advanced users, they really don't like video. But novice users, they love video. They'll watch it several times, and they'll still not understand where to click, but they like that medium. And we gathered some other things, too, about how people interact with help. But if you were to kind of restrict yourself to only using those insights that you would gain from your own usability testing, you'd certainly be at a disadvantage because nobody has time for this, right? It's like a rare opportunity that you would ever get to do this in a usability lab unless you work for a really cool company that has a special emphasis on usability. But fortunately, there are usability gurus who have already done tons of research about usability. And there's one book in particular that I was checking out that had great information. It's called Universal Principles of Design. And you can find it on Kindle or Amazon or any of these places. And what's different about this book is that it's a broad kind of survey of more than 125 different general usability design techniques or design techniques that's going to make your document. Let me back that up. That's going to make your product, not necessarily documentation product, but that will make your product much more design friendly. That'll make it user centered. And so I read through this book and picked out what I thought were relevant design principles relating to documentation and technical writing, specifically around organizing content. I have more details on like how to write content, how to create it, keeping things readable, simple, but that's another topic. This time I want to focus just on how you organize it. Where do you put it in a way that's going to maximize the user's ability to find it and make use of it? So these are the 10 principles or so that I want to go through. Modularity, hierarchy, 5 hat racks, and these are the terms that are actually used in the book. Progressive disclosure, entry point, desire line, wayfinding, immersion, consistency, and forgiveness. So they're not really in any particular order here, but the way that I like to use these is to think of these as kind of a rubric for assessing documentation. Does your documentation stack up with these design principles? It's a great way to look at things. I gave a presentation to a company back east a couple of months ago, and how I approached it was I wanted to see their documentation site, and I looked through it, checking how they kind of align with these different principles. So some of these principles may seem somewhat simple, easy, but when you look at how they actually apply to your help, that's where things start to get interesting. Obviously, I can't do that as much since everybody probably works for different companies and so forth, but hopefully you can apply these. All right, so let's jump into number 1, modularity. And actually, before I jump in here, let me just I'll periodically check the chat to see if there are any questions. Okay, and I'll proceed. But feel free to jump in here with the chat window, or if you want through audio, and I'd be happy to stop. You don't have to wait until the end. Okay, modularity. Break up content into independent topics that can be viewed, understood, and updated independent of the whole. A topic or chunk should not be so interconnected with the whole that it cannot stand on its own. Now, I've rephrased these from the book, but I mostly kind of summarized them and tried to relate them more to documentation. This is a principle we're all familiar with. This is topic-based writing 101, right? This is the idea that your content should be able to be a little individual part that a user can jump into without having to start from scratch at the beginning of a giant manual. This idea started as far back as John Carroll in his research on minimalism, which he published in the Nuremberg Funnel. His strategy for implementing topic-based authoring was you can just read the sections about the tasks you want to do. You don't have to read the whole manual. You just pick out chapter 5 or chapter 12 and go for it. And I guess that was a revolutionary idea at the time, and now it's almost seen as tech writing 101. Modularity sounds great, but things do often go wrong, as simple as it sounds. And you get into a giant train wreck in a couple of different ways. First, writers often assume that building blocks are the same as presentation. And here I'm mostly speaking about people working in DITA models, where they have content chunked out into task, concept, reference, and these are individual components. And then when they publish their content, they're like, great, I've got all my concepts in separate concept files. Each task is in its own task file. And they don't really realize that you don't actually have to have a one-to-one mapping between these building blocks of a concept, task, and reference and the presentation. And what happens is you end up with a million tiny little topics that are just kind of, they fragment the whole information experience and send readers pinballing throughout your help. So those individual building blocks, like Legos, can be combined into more of a reader-friendly display. Another way that modularity goes wrong is if somebody starts in a print document and decides to move it online by automatically splitting it at every heading 2 tag, for example. And then what you end up with is what Mark Baker calls Frankenbooks. A Frankenbook is organized neither for linear reading nor for random access. No matter where you land in it, you're in the middle of a maze with buttons to move up, down, sideways, but no means of finding the end of any thread or narrative, great or small. Every page is page 297, and none of them answer your questions. So, this is modularity gone wrong, right? Where you no longer can access a page and get meaning from that standalone component, independent of reading and accessing the whole thing. And this is a mantra that he's really driven home in a lot of different ways, and he summarizes it as every page is page one, where you just assume that the reader can hit it at any point. And what does that mean? If a reader can hit it at any point, then your topics, they're going to be a little bit more thorough, comprehensive, no doubt longer. This is a screenshot from how to install WordPress, and it's kind of a monster, actually. It's like they cover how to install WordPress on every operating system. They cover all the snafus you can encounter, troubleshooting, but it's very self-contained, and wikis lend themselves to this style, these self-contained articles. And that's really what you sort of end up with modularity, is you have more of article type help instead of just these little tiny snippets that act as a page. Now, obviously, you can't have these monster pages. So let's say you have a sequence of 6 or 7 steps. You can build nice context at the top. Here's an example where you've got a clear workflow and you're guiding the user throughout. So even though you don't have all the steps jammed into one master long page, you've provided a way that weaves them together in a way that helps the user. And you can also provide context at the end, so that a user who hits that endpoint has some next steps. You could have direct links, or you can have some widget like this that shows you where to go next. But this is a way of kind of balancing the needs of modularity and the limits of sanity with the length of a topic. So as some best practices for keeping your content modular, make topics meaningful enough to stand on their own. Don't be afraid to make long topics. Assume the users might actually be starting out on that particular page. And if they were, what context would they need? What prerequisites, assumptions are going to be necessary, and provide those. So that's design principle 1 in organizing your content. Make it modular. Let's move on to number 2, hierarchy. A hierarchical outline of the content with parent and child items organized in trees helps users both understand and visualize complex information. Hierarchies that are too complex or which hide parent-child displays fail to communicate. Find a balance that allows users to take in the hierarchy at a glance in a meaningful way. Now, one sort of idea that I think is false and misrepresents the every page is page one strategy is that you could suddenly do away with your sidebar navigation that would contain like a table of contents through your help document. That's not necessarily the case. There is meaning in hierarchy. In a book called Designing Web Navigation, James Kalbach, a usability guy, says, navigation provides a narrative for people to follow on the web. And when you have a hierarchical list of doc items in a tree form with parent and child items, that expresses meaning about those items. A hierarchy literally is grouping content that's sub-elements under larger elements. So right away, the user understands that if you've got content grouped under an item, it must mean that it's part of that larger item, but smaller components or additional detail. And through these parent-child sort of relationships in a hierarchy, the user can get some basic meaning about the whole shape of your help content. It's definitely not something you want to disregard. If you take away the hierarchy of your help, the hierarchical representation, the navigation sidebar, ultimately, and just go with a completely flat model where a user just lands on a page and there's no like sidebar that lists the other pages in that documentation collection, you can kind of end up with a disaster. While it may work with one-off knowledge-based type articles, when a user's trying to go through help for an entire system, configuring something complex that involves multiple topics, sequential, that sort of flat approach, KB approach, really doesn't work. A good example of hierarchy. All right, hey, I just saw a question pop in there. What about mini TOCs? We'll get into that in just a minute. I think, maybe not. Why don't we address it now? So somebody asks, let me make sure I captured it all. Mini TOCs. Yeah, I think a mini TOC is a table of contents within the topic itself. So underneath your heading, it lists all the headings on the page. I think that is definitely a good thing as well. I don't think I specifically call it out, but definitely I think it feeds into the same principle of hierarchy and providing information at a glance that's consumable. Okay, so here's a good example of hierarchy. This is from a page in Google's help. And if you look on the left, you'll see that they've got some clear groupings of content, and it's not so massive that you get overwhelmed. It's pretty short. They have specifically selected out only a subset of the items out of something that might be much, much larger. I think in the old days of TriPane Web Help, it used to be that like your sidebar contained every single file in your help system, and it would be this massive sidebar that just was too daunting, and I'll get into that more later. But basically, you want to keep it so that users can see it at a glance and get meaning from it. If your sidebar is too massive that you can no longer get meaning from it, it's no longer useful. So in order to make it readable, see how you can quickly scan each of these, overview, getting started, and so forth. In order to make it readable, you can shorten the nav titles. So while your official page might be getting started building widgets for System Z, that doesn't scan so well in your sidebar. You can shorten that and still not lose out on your full page SEO and metadata and so forth that you would need for the official title. But as I was looking through some of the help content in the company I mentioned earlier, I noticed they had a lot of like really lengthy titles, and they were so long they were getting truncated, so you couldn't even see the whole title. And they would all start with these lengthy gerunds that made it difficult to really read and understand at a glance. So in addition to shortening it, consider getting rid of gerunds and using active tense, simple present tense. Here's another example from another doc set. You can see that you can quickly scan it and see what's there. And that's really the point of a hierarchy, this ability to take in the whole at a glance and gather some meaning from it. So as some best practices for hierarchy, limit the navigation to about 3 levels. Put it on the left usually. You can also put it on the right, but one of the sides is very common. In fact, I know there was a trend recently to get rid of that third pane because it looked somewhat dated, or that third column, and to put it along the top in these kind of innovative drop downs from breadcrumbs. I just don't think that's very common. I think it confuses users. You want to align with industry standards that people are going to expect. Allow users to see the full navigation at a glance. This is one that's a little probably controversial, and I'd love to have more research, but right now, basically, a lot of times you land on these sidebars and they're accordions, so you can only expand one section at a time. Well, that's fine because it helps keep it small and concise, but what if you want to see what's in every section so that you can get a glance at the whole? The accordion feature really limits your ability to do that. Break up massive navigation into multiple menus. You don't want to have these giant massive sidebar. You might have several different sidebars relating to different product facets or different facets of your product. And you need to allow the user to navigate from one menu to another. That's where it gets a little more sophisticated and where a lot of the help authoring tools kind of break down. But anyway, whatever tool platform you're using, you should have a way to create multiple different help sets and allow navigation from one set to the other. And then, oh yeah, put page level navigation on the page, preferably on the right or in line. This is the mini TOC thing, which I guess I do address here. Okay, see if we have any questions. All right, we've got one right here. Filtering options for content display as well. Trying to think, what exactly does that mean? Is that like faceted navigation that would allow you to select a facet, like version, and then the navigation filters down to that? If so, sure. Now, actually, I'm going to talk about that soon. This is where we get into 5-hat racks, which, okay, so there's some kind of history with 5-hat racks, and I think seminal research around it used it as a metaphor. But 5-hat racks is the idea that you can organize content in 5 different ways. You can arrange it alphabetically. You can sort it by time. You can arrange it by location, by continuum or degree, like most novice to advanced or something, and by category or likeness. Generally, documentation is grouped by category or likeness more than location, with the exception of context-sensitive help. And really, this last point is where you see a lot of writers, where you see most relevance to documentation. As an example, check out this little graphic here. This is from the book. You can see they've got different monuments or buildings, skyscrapers, there we go. And you can organize the same group of skyscrapers in 5 different ways. Alphabetically, starting with the Canadian National Tower and ending with the World Trade Center. By time, by location, probably a more difficult one. By continuum, so maybe getting short to tall. Or category. Yeah, so these ones are all similar in appearance or structure, and these are more similar in structure. So basically in documentation, let me jump ahead there. There's kind of two ways to describe this. User-centered documentation is organized by task, usually, whereas product-centered documentation is organized by tabs or screens. And in order to make sense to the user, you want to choose the former, obviously. It's very difficult for a user who's unfamiliar with the user interface or how the screens are to really make sense of product-centered documentation. Now, this is easier to say than do, because sometimes you have a screen and you want to describe all the features on the screen, and they don't necessarily relate to what the user might specifically do. So this is a challenge. And then, of course, if you have context-sensitive help, where you click a help link on the page, you want to open up all the topics related to that page, you're kind of being pushed and nudged towards more product-centered documentation. So just keep in mind the two, and yeah, try to choose the former. There's one technique that's pretty common in usability circles called affinity diagramming. This is one technique to try to group things. These are actually former colleagues that I had, and they had this huge survey with hundreds of responses, and they wanted to group them into categories that made sense. So they put them on all these sticky notes, stuck them all the way around the walls in random orders, and then invited about 10 people to come in and group them logically by likeness. And so you'd have users move sticky notes, and another user moves the same sticky note, and they finally agree on an order that surfaces. I've never actually tried this with documentation, but it could be something that helps you establish a user-centered organization based on actual users and how they think. Anyway, just wanted to throw that in there. Now, faceted navigation. Somebody brought this up, and I do want to address it. Peter Morville, one of the experts on findability and taxonomy, says faceted navigation is arguably the most significant search innovation of the past decade. He said this in Search Patterns. And this is a pretty strong statement. And for a number of years, I tried to implement faceted navigation, but really didn't make much progress in doing it. First of all, the tools really aren't there to do the facets. You pretty much have to have a custom implementation or plug into some other kind of framework. But second, documentation doesn't really have clear facets. When you go into a shoe store, there are clear facets of, do I want men's shoes, women's shoes, basketball shoes, soccer cleats? Do I want size 12? Do I want color red, blue? But with documentation, it's like, well, your facets are kind of topic based. So it doesn't really work as clear hinge points unless you have lots of different doc sets and you can divide them by version and operating system or by programming language. But if you do want facets, one practical way to implement them is through tags. So if you have a tag like operating system, Mac or something, you could add that to one of your topics and then provide a grouping based on that tag. I haven't really seen tags used successfully in help in a way that impressed me, so I just sort of add this as a footnote, but generally the idea of organizing your content by likeness and category is the main driving principle here for the usability. Okay. Let me just check the... Okay. By tags, you mean conditional text type tags? If you've ever just seen a WordPress blog and you've seen little tags on there, it's a keyword that acts as a link. When you click it, all the other topics that have that same keyword are listed on the page. So, yeah. And different systems would implement that differently. I'm sure in Flare you have a similar concept. You add tags to something and then you can add a certain widget that will show all topics with that same tag.
Tom?
Yep.
This is Barbara. I believe that 2015 version of RoboHelp allows you to set up a help deliverable and apply, I think the word is categories, but I'm not certain of the name. And if you apply those tags or selections to content, you can then, in the output, allow the user to click on categories to filter the content that displays based on the combination of filters they choose.
Yeah. Well, good. Yeah. Like I said, I would love to see... I would love to see an actual help system that used tags in a brilliant way that it was really impressive. I really don't see it. I think what most people do is just create different outputs and keep things separated. I mean, tags would be pretty handy if all your stuff was in one big bowl of soup and you really needed sophisticated ways to keep it separated. I know that like Fluid Topics, for example, they have some amazing stuff they do with filtering. Probably the best example, but even so, like, you really want every single version and every language and every operating system all on the same site? It puts a lot more pressure on your navigation to be more sophisticated and robust. All right, I'm going to jump in.
Responsive. The idea of responsive content. Isn't that part of that metadata that allows you to deliver just what the users...
Yeah, well, then you have to have the user logged in, and so you have some kind of profile that tells you what system they have, and then you need a content management system that delivers that, so you're already in a much more sophisticated system. And then you have things like search, right? A user searches. Now you've got to have a separate search index based on all of their metadata. It's so much more complex that few people really are going to implement it well without...
Able to do it.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Sure. All right. And by the way, if you want more on faceted navigation, check out David Weinberger's books. He's got some brilliant books about this. And like conceptually, I'm in complete alignment. I just have never seen it applied really well to docs. All right. Now here's a topic that is pretty solid advice that is easier to follow. Progressive disclosure. Layer information so that you don't present everything to the user at once. Make some information available only at secondary or tertiary levels of navigation. just to give some more information on this, so this is the idea that you don't want to overwhelm a user, right? You've got maybe hundreds of topics, but if you presented all those topics to the user in one giant navigation tree, it's paralyzing. A user doesn't need to know all that up front. I think one design trend that I've seen that I think is just going in the wrong direction is when a navigation sidebar incorporates the mini TOC on the page, so that now your navigation sidebar not only has every topic, but every heading within every topic, and it just becomes very difficult for a user to get going in that. In Jacob Nielsen's interaction design, he says he's really a big fan of progressive disclosure. He says it's the best tool so far. Show people the basics first, and once they understand that, allow them to get to the expert features. But don't show everything all at once, or you'll only confuse people, and they will waste endless time messing with features that they don't yet need. This is really difficult to kind of pull off, right? Here's an example of a help center. They've got different groupings, and let's say you want to know more about timesheets. Well, you click that link, and then you're going to see all the topics about timesheets. Presumably the ones shown here are the most popular. But that's one way of limiting the amount of information that you're exposing at the first level. If you ever do any kind of UX mockups or UI mockups with your help system, designers like to think in terms of levels. What do you see at level 1? What do you see at level 2, at level 3, and level 4? And that kind of progressive information disclosure is something to keep in mind, especially with docs, because we have so many different topics. Here's an example of progressive disclosure in the user interface. If you're in WordPress and you pull down their help drawer, or at least it used to be this way, you could click a link and see information about it in a kind of summary form. And if you wanted more, then you click the link to go to the full page. But it's a way of presenting part of the info somebody needs. And of course, any context-sensitive help is kind of the same way. Another example is this Twitter organization. If you click any one of these links, using Twitter, my account, fix a problem, then you'll see more topics related to those groups. But the authors don't present all the links to the user at once, right? It's like, you tell me what you want to know about, and I'm going to give you a little bit more information about that topic. All right, no questions on that, I don't think. Again, it's so much more fascinating when you turn the lens of these seemingly basic principles onto your own help and try to see how they apply. Another one is performance load. The larger, more complex the system, the greater the strain on the user. And the greater the strain, the lower the user's success. In many cases, documentation that is too massive deflates the user from even trying at all. There was an article I really liked by Martin Fowler called The Almighty Thud. He talks about the sound that a big, thick user manual makes as it hits the table and strikes fear into the user's heart. It just kind of demotivates them. This is a comic an old colleague once drew. Here's the manual for your new software, all 16 volumes. Thanks, but I'll wait for the Reader's Digest version. Right? If you've got a very, very complex system, which a lot of us are documenting, your users are not going to have strong success if you just throw everything to them at once, right? The larger and more difficult the task, the higher risk and chance that they're going to fail. So what do you do to help them not fail, to help them succeed in the face of such challenging sort of systems? Actually, before I get to that, one more thing. This is called Moore's Law, not Moore's Law, Moore's Law. An information retrieval system will tend not to be used whenever it is more painful and troublesome for a customer to have information than for him not to have it, which is a really poor way of saying, basically, if it really pains the user to have your information, to acquire it, the user is really not going to do it until it becomes so painful for the user not to have that information that they finally break down and decide to go into the help to get it. So my strategy for trying to avoid this performance load strain on the user is quick reference guides. Instead of eliminating this useful info, provide a quick reference guide to help them get oriented quickly with minimal cognitive load and low cost. Now, quick reference guides are they're like getting started guides. It's kind of the same category here, but a quick reference will try to cover the whole guide in a compressed, almost poetry-like form. Like Cliff Notes or a cheat sheet, it will show the shape of your whole help content. And it's especially useful for lists of functions or classes and methods. Here's an example. This is from Shopify. They make a scripting language called Liquid. And here in this quick reference, you can see all the different parts of Liquid. You can see that there are template variables, there are filters, there are operators, and this overview helps you see the whole shape of the content, and it helps pull things into place, having this view. And it's very minimal. Each of these is a little expandable section, and then you get a tiny snippet of information with a link to get more. Here's another sample. This is a getting started, but almost every good developer docs section has some kind of Hello World tutorial getting started that pulls the user through the initial kind of how do you get going in the most minimal way. And it's the same concept. You want to reduce the performance load so that the user doesn't have to create the whole challenging system from scratch. Now you can these are two early quick reference guides I created once when I was first kind of getting into these. When I created these layouts, I later Greeked the text here so that I could display them. The product manager was so happy. He was so happy that he told me in a meeting when he was distributing these that he actually started crying a little bit because he felt that finally a writer got it, that people don't want long instructions. They want something simple, quick, easy in a 2-page handout. Well, it's obviously a false idea that you can just get rid of the 200-page manual and get by with 2 pages. It's this idea of simplicity that product managers would love to believe that they've built a product so simple you only need 2 pages of instructions. But even despite this, it's going to trick users mentally into getting into it. People are much more likely to get into help when you give them this little toehold into it, foothold into the documentation. It's like when you're doing dishes at home, right? You've got this huge mountain of dishes, and it's very deflating. But then you get through like a little part of them, and then it's not so bad, and then suddenly you find that you're just like in the rhythm, and before long you've actually done the whole pile. But it's getting started that's hard, and that's what these things allow you to do. So there's lots of different layout options you can do, and I actually have a post if you go to this with a bunch of ideas for layouts. Magazines are great examples of good, attractive layouts you can implement. Okay. Let me check the chat questions. All right. Entry point. The entry point to your system should orient users and allow them to easily get started. Avoid barriers that block, confuse, or otherwise hinder the user's progress to their goal. And when I think of entry points, I like to think of train stations. This is Grand Central Station. When you go into Grand Central, it's this awesome, cool-looking room, but really the purpose is to route people to different locations. And that's what an entry point, your homepage, your help, should be. It should be like, hey, user, are you trying to implement this widget? Okay, go here. Oh, are you trying to do this? Go there. So the homepage shouldn't be this general about the system, this as if they'd never even heard of what the system they're using is and they want to learn about it from scratch. No, it's a routing page that helps users get to the place, to their destination quickly. A great example is with Microsoft Azure Docs. They've got little cards on the homepage that let users go into different doc worlds. If you want to learn about Linux virtual machines, you click that first card, and then the sidebar and all the content around there conforms to Linux virtual machines. I think this trend is definitely becoming more apparent with docs, where you see this kind of card-based entry point, or at least lists of links, and then the world conforms to that choice you made at the start. So again, think about your own doc homepage. What is the entry point for docs? Of course, the entry point could be a page in the help, but eventually users will start here as well as they try to find where they're going. All right, another principle is called desire line. If you look at the common paths that users take through information and then make those paths more prominent and standard, it will help your documentation be more user focused. And this principle comes from the idea of or the idea that users will take the path that they want to take. Even if you have square corners in your park with beautiful sidewalks, people will make little paths that kitty corner, and that's how they will go, because that's where they really want to go. In fact, I read in this book that Central Park in New York decided to first kind of put the park there, see where people were naturally going to walk, and then later cemented those pathways in, which was brilliant. So in your documentation, how does this apply? Well, look at your metrics. This is Google Analytics from my own blog, just as a sample. I see that there are a lot of people, for example, checking out Swagger. They're interested in Swagger and quick reference guides. Well, what I should really do is make my homepage have quick links to those most common topics. And in our documentation at my work, we're in the process of implementing something like this. We found our top 10 topics, and we're going to put those on the homepage so that people can more easily find them, that they don't have to try to search just to locate those most desired topics. There's a rule that you've all heard called the 80-20 rule. 20% of your effort results in 80% of the results. So let's say you have 100 topics. 20 of those are going to be my brain is now going backwards. 80% of your hits are going to come from 20% of your pages. So you want to take this 20% of your pages and make them front and center. They should occupy it, because that's what most people are looking for. 80% of the content we write is just like not even used, right? Of course, understanding what the 20% is and the 80% is part of the challenge. Oh, we got a question here. Let's check it out. What tools do you use for analytics? At my work, we use Omniture or Adobe Analytics, and that gives you lots of robust configuration. Google Analytics is free. If you have other applications like an app, there are other analytics tools like Flurry Analytics. There's Clickstream and quite a few different analytics options. It's actually quite difficult to interpret analytics when you open them up and you see that they have like a 70% bounce rate, which means people landed on the page, didn't go anywhere else, and then exited your site. It's hard to really make sense of that. It's like, did they find the information they wanted, or was it a false sort of hit? Time on page is, most people spend 2 seconds per page, and then others spend 5 minutes, and it all gets averaged out. So making sense of analytics is another art, but basically you will at least see what the top pages are in your analytics. You see what are the most popular pages. Everyone should know what the most popular doc pages are, and with that you can try to make that desire line more formal. I just explained that. Okay, I have just a few more principles here. One is called wayfinding. Provide navigational signposts such as breadcrumbs or other workflow maps to help orient users as to where they are in a larger system. Don't assume that the user navigated to the current page following the path you intended. Now, navigational signposts can come in a lot of different forms in the design world. But in documentation, breadcrumbs are probably the most common, or some kind of workflow map like the one I showed earlier. Here's an example from Facebook stocks. If you land on this page from a Google search, it really helps to have this context to know where is this? How is this information contextualized here in the larger set. And the breadcrumbs do an ingenious job of this. They're not all that hard to implement, and they provide a lot of payoff. I think too often we sort of think that users are navigating top-down. They're starting in the category, they're drilling into the folder, and then they're getting to the topic. So why would they need me to display a breadcrumb? But of course we know they come into the topics from searches, from links, from who knows where. They're clicking around, they're landing there. They may not know if it's documentation, a blog post, a knowledge base article, some random user page. So providing this context is definitely welcome. It's something the usability people say is welcomed by users. It's not ever going to harm your usability. There are different ways to implement this. And I think I won't dive into that more. Okay, 2 more principles. Users desire to be immersed in the application or system they're using rather than leaving the system to consult a separate external system for help. Allow users to stay immersed in the application context by bringing help into the application. This principle of immersion makes a lot of sense if you've ever been using a system and you're getting frustrated because you're not finding something. The idea of going out of that system into another another system, a documentation system, to find your answer is immediately jarring. I want to stay in the place where I'm trying to complete my task. Don't make me go somewhere else, and let me stay immersed and focused. I once interviewed Mike Hughes about what do we know from usability studies with help, and he said the conclusion of most studies about how people use help is that they don't use help. They really don't want to go into the help system. So anything you can do to bring that help into the UI is welcome. Here's an example that you could implement if you wanted to do tooltips, for example. Very easy to bring that in. You can single source the information from your help, generate it out into a format that developers can consume. If you click this link, I've got a tutorial about how to do this using Jekyll and generate a JSON file and bring it in using JavaScript. I did it once. I gave a developer a JSON file that had 30 or 40 different tooltips, and the UX person either used my sample JavaScript code or created their own and incorporated them, and that way I could control all the tooltips in the same file. It was sourced from the help, and it was a lot of fun. But the principle is, how can I move into the same space as my user? How are you organizing your help? We'll organize it in the application. Have to remember, there's a related law here called Fitts' law. The further a user must travel with their cursor, the less accuracy the user will have in reaching the target object, which is a really fancy way of saying that if a user has to go to a totally different system and click far away, they're probably not going to find exactly what they were looking for. It's important to remember that much of a UI is text. So this is from some system. It's called Beejit. If you take away the text, this is what it looks like. There's almost nothing there. Same with WordPress. Here's WordPress without text, and here's YouTube without text. I think too often we're sort of under this idea that the interface and help are totally separate things, but these user faces are textual domains, and help belongs there. That's how people find and navigate things, and so we should insert as much as we can in there for not as much as we can, but we should not feel as if it's not our domain. It's definitely a domain where writers are welcome. Okay, we are coming near the end. This is the last principle: forgiveness. Taking risks, experimenting, and exploring systems on their own helps users learn. When users make errors during these activities, help guide them back on the right path. All right, so this also relates to the idea of immersion. You've got a user doing something. Let's say they're in the command line and they do something wrong. You want to provide information, help information in that same space that helps them correct. Here in my Jekyll project, I have an incorrect parameter, and you can see here that it says, look, you've got the syntax wrong, buddy. Here's the valid syntax, param equals value, and it's in this file. So now I don't have to leave my context. I can just fix it. I can stay right in this command line. And trying to figure out where all these potential error points are where you should implement forgiveness can be really challenging. But you definitely want to find all the error messages in your system, right? Go down all these unhappy paths. Test everything yourself. That's the best way to find them. Throw in garbage data for parameters. Try to break it, see what happens, and expose these areas where people are going to need forgiveness, and then try to provide information that's going to help them there. I saw a question come in. Also related, what tools, no, that was already one we answered, related to minimalism. Okay. Yeah, definitely. Minimalism, I think, often gets misinterpreted as just being really concise and brief, when really it's helping the user jump into the task and not having to wade through a bunch of documentation, get them going, right? And so to facilitate that action-oriented mindset, you want to provide the documentation in the same space where they're doing those actions. All right, easier said than done, right? These design principles, I don't think there's anything here that is revolutionary or like incredibly clever and brilliant that you would never think yourself, but they're much harder to implement, right? You're battling timelines, you're trying to figure out how to even get the right information in the first place, much less how to integrate it into the right space for the user to find as they're trying things out, you know. But having this set of principles, modularity, hierarchy, 5-hat racks, progressive disclosure, entry point, desire line, wayfinding, immersion, consistency, forgiveness, gives you a rubric or list of things you can analyze and assess your help against, and see kind of how are you doing with user-centered documentation. All right, any questions? We've had some come in, but if you have more that you'd like, go ahead and ask them now. I'll point you to...
Yes,
okay.
We have a question here. I'm going to have to repeat it for you.
Okay.
I've got a manual where it's a medical device. I need to have about 4 pages of warnings and cautions, or, you know, have boring stuff, but very essential because each patient or kill yourself or the patient without. So she has a manual, a medical device with
I heard.
manual.
I heard.
And there's about 4 pages of important warnings and things that relate to danger with the device. And it's the usual kind of stuff that it's like, I'm trying to figure out how to get the person to read it. It's putting it, most manuals of this type, they put it in front with the... Like how to get people to read it. To actually operate it. Like put it up front or put it in line? It's going to be...
Well...
print. It is a print guide.
I think that very
That's
okay.
the challenge.
Yeah. So about those little initial sections that tell you this icon means danger and this means tip and so forth. You know, I really think the icons and symbols that you use, and this is actually another principle in the design book on, I can't remember what it's called, icons or symbols, but you should use the icons that are globally universally understood. And if it's not immediately clear that like a danger with a red exclamation point, you know, means warning, risk, you know, high chance of failure, then you should use a different icon set that you don't have to explain. Now, you may be under constraints, maybe you're required legally to do this, but in general, use icons that makes immediate sense. And one way that you can find out what icons are the universal symbols is go to something called thenounproject.com. Search for what you're looking for. Like, for example, let's look at this. I was doing this a while back for, we were trying to find an icon for voice-enabled text. So anyway, if you type in something like danger, you're going to see how different people have represented danger in icons. and you'll find very common ones like either the lightning bolt or something else. But you can get a sense for, okay, what is kind of the universal symbol for what I'm talking about? And then you shouldn't have to explain it. So I think that's how I would approach it. And if you do have to explain it, the front is not going to be that bad because it's a standard that most people do, right? So people expect that kind of thing. It's not going to surprise anybody.
Thank you.
Somebody asked another question. You mentioned knowledge a couple of times. How do you define a knowledge item versus other types of documentation? I think I referred to a knowledge base type article, something that's a quick explanation of some technical difficulty that's outside the realm of docs. There's actually another design principle that I don't think I included here, but somewhere else. I'm trying to remember the exact name, but it's basically the shape of a bell curve. You want to have your documentation hit the mainstream of what most people are trying to accomplish. If you fill your docs with a bunch of edge cases and fringe scenarios and one-off quirks that only a small minority of people are going to run into, you end up diluting your information so that people can't really find what they're looking for because they're encumbered by so much information that only applies to such a small number of people. So what do you do with that info? You don't get rid of it, but move it into some kind of knowledge base that allows people to just search for that and surface that content that way. Okay. Looking forward to recording to share with non-tech writer boss. If you can get a non-tech writer boss to listen to an hour recording, great. Anyway, let me just point you to one other source. If you're really into this topic and you want more information on it, come up to my site, and I'm starting to get some more information here on user-centered documentation. And I've actually got some more principles here that cover creation of content, like readability, legibility, signal-to-noise ratio, and so forth, so you can learn more about it. And I'd love to hear your feedback. Feel free to get in touch with me. If you come to About Contact, you can reach out to me don't call me. I'm going to take my phone number off here, but feel free to reach out to me via email or Slack. I'd be happy to chat with you. Thank you so much. Have a great evening. I know it's Valentine's Day. I can't imagine too many people. Yeah, and I'm sure you've got plans. So I'll sign off here and let you go. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Tom.
Bye-bye.
Have a great evening.
Yep. You too.
Bye.